I'm also curious too about what you think of the real push, and this is now from the Inflation Reduction Act as well, for electric vehicles to be the catch-all climate solution here, as opposed to say, I don't know, making our transit systems run in a way where we like people can feasibly use public transit throughout the country. But I mean, even just regionally, where areas where we already have a lot of transit lines, they're just not updated or expanded. Like that is another way to maintain the status quo and not undercut auto manufacturers or anything like that. You can still use these credits to manufacture cars, but it's not the most sustainable way forward.
No, I mean, you've touched on it there. I think, electric vehicles better in many ways than having, a sort of conventional combustion engine on the road, but absolutely not without sort of physical impact and cost, right? In terms of the materials that go into, particularly the batteries. And there's an academic that, many viewers might know called Thea Rea-Francos, who does sort of brilliant work kind of tracing the impacts of specifically, the lithium mining industry throughout the global south and sort of South America in particular, because it's such a kind of water intensive and environmentally destructive form of mining. It has major impacts on sort of indigenous and local communities in Chile and neighboring countries. And so there are real concerns to be had about sort of relying on just replacing, the abundance of personal vehicles in the US or anywhere in the world, one to one, that is kind of just conveniently sort of sidelined for two reasons, I think. One of which is, the kind of real politic of passing climate policy in the US and in many other places, Canada, notwithstanding, is that you need to kind of convince people often that there'll be minimal disruption to the kind of lifestyles that they're maybe accustomed to, rather than trying to, I think, tell people the much more positive story that, your car kind of sucks. Commuting is terrible. Your car probably spends, I think the statistic is like 90% of its lifespan parked for the average vehicle. 50 square kilometers of the city of London where I live are taken up by parking spaces that could be housing or green space. All of these terrible things about having a society dominated by individual cars, could be turned into a very positive story about how we could totally organize mobility differently and in a way that's just much better for everybody. And, so I think the politics of that are probably, in my view, sort of poorly done, but understandable in terms of kind of not wanting to rock the boat. But the other thing is that from the green capitalism perspective, that's broadly necessary, right? So, for the kind of green capitalist approach to policymaking, the idea is that, all of the things that we want to have in a kind of like green, low carbon future can and must be profit making and profitable. And so for the corporate sector, for investors, having ideally decommodified, but maybe let's just say affordable kind of decarbonized mass public transit, that is a far less appealing prospect than, everyone having their sort of vehicles replaced one to one with EVs. And so that kind of logic, I think, pervades as well, right? Which is that if we leave this transition to, we kind of abdicate the question of planning and strategy, and we leave it to the profit motive, then this is the kind of result that we'll inevitably see.
Right. And I mean, this is the fatal flaw, and it's it completely embedded in every element of the Inflation Reduction Act, unfortunately. I mean, it is a market-based climate bill, and that's not to say that it's better than doing nothing. Of course it is, but that you can see someone like Joe Manchin's fingerprints all over this, and that's what makes it so alien to what we were talking about when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced the Green New Deal in her freshman year or freshman term as a member of Congress. That's so there were, of course, market solutions and market incentives in that an initial proposal, but the more robust kind of infrastructure elements, as opposed to tax credits and incentives for private corporations, those were included as well. And it's a real missed opportunity that we had a hostage taker in Manchin as the 50th vote in the Senate, because really, as you lay out so well, this is going to be insufficient, wildly so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act for me is such an interesting case because in many ways it was this kind of very marked departure from what had dominated American climate politics, you know, for every year prior to the IRA that it had been discussed, right? Which was carbon pricing. Ever since Waxman-Markey, that has always been the fixation and broadly something that's always failed. And so there is this real pivot from sort of pricing and sort of tweaks to the market to, what can be understood broadly as, an industrial strategy with some green bits. And I think that is a really positive shift in that kind of basic sense. But you're absolutely right that that's come with these kind of incredible carve outs for, yes, there's some direct public investment and it's very substantial in many ways, but the most of what's going to happen in terms of investment through this bill will be, subsidy for private sector actors to kind of get their hands on a lot of this infrastructure and a lot of the kind of industries of this kind of green future. And, I think there's a lot of people who say, what's really the problem with that? What we just want is to see, investment flow in, and we just want to see these industries built up. And I think, there's a grain of truth to that. I think there's, there's an urgency to what we're facing that means that we have to take, I guess, some compromises. But I think the real danger that I see is that, what we are doing is exactly what I just described, right? Which is handing over the question of kind of planning and of ensuring that we kind of do this in a way that is not only, fast enough and at the kind of scale we need to see, but that is also kind of based in sort of justice and not just kind of massively sidelining and harming kind of poorer communities of color, communities in the global south, which is like something that often happens with kind of industrial strategy and industrial policy. And, instead we're handing over the reins to private sector motivations and broadly to sort of large kind of titanic investment firms like BlackRock or some of the big private equity firms in an industry that's hugely concentrated. So it's this kind of very undemocratic process, you might say, in terms of, who is really going to be driving forward where capital flows. And that's going to be based in the specific set of interests of kind of a handful of investment firms rather than thinking strategically about what it is that we really need. And, accepting that one, not everything that we need for the transition to a kind of decarbonized society can be made profitable. Things like care, for example, and other forms of kind of service work that aren't the kind of conventional things that we think of as green, but that are absolutely going to need to be kind of scaled up in the kind of society that we want to see. Those are sectors that are never going to be appealing or profitable in the way that, the private sector might want. And the other is that, everything that can be made profitable shouldn't necessarily be, right? So just because it can be profitable doesn't mean that we should, have things be more costly to people because, firms have the incentive to maximize their profit and pay out to shareholders. And I think that kind of dual logic is very much present and alive in the IRA. But it does have some fun carve-outs, like the kind of direct pay question for sort of municipal governments and sort of not-for-profits, which is exciting compared to, again, sort of previous subsidy regimes. But I like to give like a slight silver lining rather than just
I appreciate it. Yeah. My last question here, and I'll let you go, but I wanted to see if you could expand even more on the point about how lithium mining is kind of another reboot of our offsetting of the worst of the climate catastrophe and capitalism onto the global south. This is what we talk about when we talk about climate injustice and inequity. And it's important, I think, that like a lot of the youth climate movement is a lot more cognizant of including voices from the global south where these effects are being felt. But lithium mining in particular, because this is going to be a natural resource thing that the United States is going to be extractive once again in Latin America over this. Explain that to the audience if you don't mind, Adrienne.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, we often talk about when we think about batteries or some of the industries, people talk about critical minerals, these things that are, very destructive forms of mining, but that are in tiny supply. And so lithium, because it is actually a very abundant resource, there's no kind of shortage of lithium, has often been kind of sidelined because people assume that, because it's abundant, that that's kind of fine. And a lot of it to date has come from kind of Australia. But going forward, to meet the projections that sort of governments have set for what they would like the uptake of personal kind of electric vehicles to be, the International Energy Agency projects that, we need to, from 2020 levels, that lithium demand will increase by 40-fold just by 2040. So over a 20-year span, 40 times as much lithium that needs to be mined just to meet the demand for electric vehicles. And, that is going to be potentially catastrophic to the regions where most of the kind of unexploited lithium remains, which is broadly kind of the Atacama Desert in South America. And a lot of the time, these are areas that are sort of directly relied upon by indigenous communities. They're also usually incredibly sort of water sort of scarce. So kind of desert areas, salt flats, high in the kind of mountains. And lithium itself, is an incredibly water intensive process, one of the forms of extracting it. So you kind of use water shot underground and you kind of get these lithium salts coming through the brine. And it's already having sort of very devastating impacts on communities' abilities to, sustain their own kind of water supplies just to exist, let alone to engage in the kind of agriculture that they would normally, form part of their economy. It's also potentially very destructive to biodiversity and to some of the sort of water systems that nature relies upon. And so it is absolutely, by neglecting to, I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of people to think about, we're so desperate to be like, please give us any kind of climate solution and any policy that is going to cut emissions, and EVs are included in that it feels uncomfortable to then admit that there are serious environmental and social justice questions related to that. But I think it absolutely needs to be sort of front and center in the conversation, not least because there are so many ways to avoid it, like we've already touched upon, by, thinking about other forms of kind of mass transit and thinking about EVs as kind of like a last resort used for those who absolutely can't get around in other ways, and embracing other forms of how we could organize our society and resources.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Adrienne Buller, a senior fellow at Commonwealth, author of The Value of a Whale on the Illusions of Green Capitalism. We will put a link to your book in the podcast, YouTube descriptions, and all of that, and at majority.fm. Thanks, Adrienne. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Bye.